A map provides a powerful perspective on the society that made it. Art shows what a culture values. Literature what a culture believes. A map shows both value and belief. If I were an anthropologist and was allowed a single artifact from which I was to glean all that I can ever learn of an unknown culture, I would not choose a painting, a gadget, or any single book. I believe there could be no better choice than an atlas, or if none existed, that culture's most esteemed map of their world. Today's map is a great visual example. It is a map of North America, and it could have only come from France. In this video, we're going to inspect its every detail and learn what it can tell us of that particular country in that particular year. You'll be surprised how much our map is like a microscope with a whole country beneath its lens. Welcome to the Eye of History, where we investigate the world one historic map at a time. If you enjoy deep dives into history and culture, then please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. By the mid-19th century, cartography was a mature science and a major industry. Maps were no longer based on conjecture, but on surveys and scientifically minded explorations. Governments were doing most of the surveying and often sponsoring the cartographic work. The technical hurdles that had been holding cartography back from the beginning were now overcome. With the invention of the marine chronometer in 1759, measuring longitude was now something possible on board a ship. With the work of the polymath Johann Heinrich Lambert in 1772, the mathematics of projecting the globe onto flat paper was completely unblocked. The crushing logistical requirements of the Napoleonic Wars impressed upon every European nation the importance of cartography, not just in military planning, but in fully exploiting and growing the nation's resources. By the mid-19th century, every nation had its cartographers, and, inevitably, reflecting their distinct cultures, every nation had its cartographic style. In Britain, cartography was clean, simple, to the point. Of course it was. Britain was the home of John Stuart Mill, the great expounder of utilitarianism, the idea that reduced the complex subject of morality to a single, simple concept, maximizing utility. He was also the author of A System of Logic, which neatly organized all valid methods of rational thought into a handful of laws and concepts. Mills brought a mechanics viewpoint to philosophy, which was appropriate, as Britain was a land of mechanics. There were no keys, no cartouches, no extraneous data, just the bare design, as though just drawn by the hand of God. The Germans, however, were under the sway of the great naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, the author of Cosmos. Nothing, no natural phenomenon seemed too abstruse for Humboldt to study. The whole world, from earthquakes to breezes, was something to be attacked by observation and logic. If full knowledge still eluded the German mind, at least by dint of effort through cataloging and analysis, ignorance would be slowly eroded away. German cartographers displayed their scientific bent with thematic maps, which took great advantage of the new printing technology they invented, lithography. Pastel colors now illumined a rational German world. Americans, in contrast, were still in the afterglow of the Second Great Awakening. A civil war was looming over the issue of slavery, made more imminent by the prevailing ideals of temperance and benevolence, ideals which fed the abolitionist movement. It was an optimistic creed, which encouraged a map in which the survey became the reality. Lines were laid where the surveyor willed. States and counties wouldn't be limited by mere rivers and mountains. This optimism could not help but appear on their maps, along with a unique practicality. Where other cartographers put population data, American cartographers ignored that statistic, which was sure to be outdated before the map was even printed. They put something more practical on the page. How far was it to get there? As for France, we'll let our map do the talking. Our mapmaker is Victor Levasseur. We know little of his biography, but his maps and atlases were the standard in libraries, town halls, and schools throughout the country. Our map comes from his greatest work, the Atlas National Illustraire, first published in 1844 and reprinted many times over for nearly 4 decades. The map is of North America, dated 1844, and is, I believe, the ideal model of a French map of the time. Let me show you what I mean. We'll start our analysis by looking at what Levasseur put on the map itself. At this scale, Levasseur had to choose carefully what to show. He tended to favor rivers and lakes. In America, as in France in 1844, these were of more strategic and economic importance than roads or boundaries. A smattering of cities are indicated, along with a number of frontier forts and missions. The only borders presented are national boundaries, and those in barely perceptible dotted lines. Only 2 indigenous peoples get some mention, the Esquimaux and the Chippewas, for whom an entire pays or country is assigned in Manitoba. It isn't delineated by dotted lines, but it could have been, as both America and Britain recognized their rights to specific territories. The omissions suggest that at this point of time, the French had little interest in the original occupants of the land. This was not the case 80 years earlier, when the Indians were important allies in the French war against Britain in the Americas. In those years, French maps treated the indigenous very differently. But we'll see, that's not the only example of the cartographer's callous approach regarding the formerly important. Further south, we see the Texas Republic, delineated with a dotted line boundary given a sovereign state. Unfortunately for me, someone revised my map by coloring in new boundaries after Texas became one of the United States. Texas had an outsized importance to the French. King Louis-Philippe had a pro-Texas policy, and the French hoped that an independent Texas could become a source of cotton distinct from the American South, dominated as it was by British merchants. Those hopes, of course, were dashed just 2 years after this map was printed. On the opposite side of the United States, we see an interesting anomaly, the boundary between the States and British America. Note, this area is not yet Canada. Drawn at 54 degrees, 40 minutes. After the War of 1812, the 2 countries had negotiated their boundary at the 49th parallel only as far as the Rockies. The area further west was left undefined, as both Spain and Russia also had claims in the region. Only after those other claimants dropped out of the contest did this last stretch of boundary become a point of contention. The Democrat Party in America pushed the issue with the slogan, 54-40 or fight, and we find a handful of maps in this era displaying this aggressively placed boundary line. Of course, our French map must be one such map. What French cartographer could resist poking at the English in this way? Yet Levasseur did not take up the chance he had to poke at the British in Canada itself. At this time, Canada was distinct from Labrador, the Maritime region, and the Northwest Territories, and is shown here by the outdated terms Upper and Lower Canada, or in French, Haute and Basse Canada. From this map, it is impossible to know that a rebellion in Quebec was still smoldering, that a compromised government had a precarious hold over a combined Canada, wherein the French-speaking population was still in the majority. I personally expected that Levasseur would give some nod towards the Quebecois, but I don't see that on this map. As I've learned, at this time, French policy towards Quebec was largely to ignore the whole situation. Nearly a century had passed since Quebec was lost to the British, and its location made it fairly irrelevant to France's immediate interests. We saw earlier how Levasseur ignored 500,000 Native Americans. Here he does the same to 500,000 Francophone Quebecois. So we see that in its contents, Levasseur's map is very French, informing us very well of French attitudes and policies at the time. Now let's look closer at another feature of the map, this little statistics block. Almost all of Levasseur's maps have a block like this. For this map, he gives just the populations of the various countries and colonies, but other maps of his often show much more. His French provincial maps include data on tax receipts, government departments, bishops, and militias. They often show the acreage in various crops and the soil types. In this habit, he seems to be imitating the Germans, but he is much less thorough, much less consistent. He generally prefers text to tabular data, and when numbers are not available, he blithely uses phrases like, a great number. A German cartographer would be scandalized to use such careless language. They would also be unamused by another of Levasseurs' trademark features: blocks filled with breezy text, descriptions of natural features, flora and fauna, famous people and local history, the sort of text that today we see in tourist maps. In this, Levasseur is harking back to a map-making tradition of the Baroque era. Cartographers of that earlier era, from about 1550 to 1700 or so, often included this sort of text and illustrations to accompany it. And like Levasseur, it was almost always very genial. Their maps were meant to communicate more than the raw geography of the place drawn on the map, but the sense of the place as well. At that time, before post roads and stage services, long-distance travel was rare even for the wealthy, and these touches were appreciated by a map-buying public who would likely never experience the places that they were viewing on the map. By 1844, this sort of flavor was out of favor almost everywhere but France. Levasseur was showing himself to be a uniquely old-fashioned cartographer. But now it's time for the big reveal. I've been hiding the most important feature of the map, the most very French feature. For you see, the map covers less than a third of the page. The rest is this amazing collage, an engraving from the patriarch of a French artistic dynasty, Raymond Bonheur, and beautifully colored by hand. The engraving follows the text, which I'll read with slight amendment. The top of the drawing represents the polar regions, imposing their empire of ice and offering an insurmountable barrier to the activity of navigators seeking to approach the North Pole. In these desolate regions where terrible storms reign, enormous mountains of ice, images of death, have often stopped the ships of intrepid sailors whose loss science has had to deplore. Polar bears, seals, and whales inhabit these waters and lands where the sun barely shines. On the continent, the land of the lakes, which communicate with each other by imposing waterfalls, sees the fur trade with the savage tribes who arrive along the rivers. On the other side of the drawing, we see the railways that crisscross the United States and the Temple of Montezuma, which represents Mexico. The plants of this world serve to embellish this map, at the bottom which young America rests in the middle of the luxuriant vegetation. Most of Levasseur's maps have similar artwork, if not always so lush. Allegories like our reclining Mademoiselle America are common. In his provincial maps, we find both prosaic depictions of various commodities and allegorical figures, like this boy pouring out the waters of the vital Garonne. Levasseur's map of Algeria provides an example that is particularly French in inspiration. These figures were a callback to the art of the Renaissance and Baroque, and in 1844 it is only in France that we see them applied to maps. But though Levasseur seems to be a child of the Baroque, he was not completely stuck in the past. He was up to date with his use of consistent symbols, and most of his maps included a proper key. I would submit that this map, his New Map of La France, is entirely modern. It is, I believe, the first road and railway map of France. It uses a variety of symbols to represent capitals and post relays, dashed lines of different sorts for the types of roads, rails, and boundaries. He didn't invent any of these methods, but it shows his modernity. If not for the older printing technology and the florid title block, I submit that this map would pass for a 20th century creation. But not our map. It seems to be half Baroque, half modern. As much attention went into the artistry of the presentation as into the accuracy of the survey. It's a remarkable artifact, but is it precisely French? Americans tend to learn European history in a way that papers over the internal realities of the places we call France, England, Germany. We imagine France as a single unit, as though all of France was just the suburbs of Paris. But in 1844, France was still a sprawling assemblage of widely disparate provinces. Half of all Frenchmen didn't speak French. They spoke Occitan, Breton, Alsatian, Flemish, Catalan, Basque. Half could not sign their own name. The king, Louis-Philippe, imagined himself a modern reformer. He began as the citizen king, and one of his early achievements was the creation of a national system of primary education. Whether or not he was sincere in his affection for the working classes, his actual administration was in part repressive, in part incompetent. Those schools weren't free and barely touched the rural poor. The economy stagnated in a mire of privileges and protections. The intent? To favor development. The effect? To favor the elites. 1 foot in modernity, 1 foot in the ancient regime. He was deposed, of course, in the usual French way, but that comes a little after our map. This contradiction, this perpetual compromise between the Baroque and the modern, expressed itself not just in politics, not just in cartography, but in many other aspects of French culture. They called it the Juste Milieu, the middle way. A compromise, you might say, between the classic and the romantic. In art, the paintings of Horace Vernet, Henri Scheffer, and Joseph Désiré Court are emblematic. Some claim that the Juste Milieu was a reconciliation of the allegorical old with a passionate new. Others deride the movement as mere compromise. The paintings are undeniably the works of masters, and they were very commercially successful in their time. But in retrospect, they suffer for their commitment to not being committed to either sensibility. I am no great expert in anything French, and I cannot speak to what French culture may be today, so here I will limit my conjectures to the France of 1844. I wonder if this ambivalence, this holding to the past while fumbling towards the future, was the result of the French Revolution, when the country grasped this certain set of ideals with fervor and were rewarded for their commitment to utopia with hell, the guillotine, Napoleon, and years of bloody and profitless war. The wounds inflicted by those revolutionary enthusiasm left scars that were still visible when this map was created, and I imagine lingered some decades more. Yet I wonder, there is some evidence that this French ambivalence is older than Robespierre and Danton. Perhaps it appears in the French tardiness in embracing the Industrial Revolution, or before that, in their belated efforts to explore the globe. I personally do not have the means to collect Juste Milieu paintings. I wish I did. Among them are masterworks that, as they say, hang well, but they seem to be out of favor among collectors today. The same seems to be true for my map. I don't think there's another in my collection that makes a better display than this map, but Levasseur has never been popular to collect. I suppose that it's because Levasseur's maps rarely made it out of France, so awareness in the Anglosphere is low, and the supply is ample, as his Atlas National Illustraire remained in print for decades. I've never seen a Levasseur sell for more than $400, and you can find entire atlases for under $1,000. Although you must be very careful when buying complete books regarding the condition. My particular map, though, is certainly the most valuable today of all Levasseur's. First, it is from the first edition of the Atlas. Second, the engraving is wonderfully well colored and by hand. And third, it has two elements that themselves are highly sought after. There are very few maps available to collectors that show the 5440 boundary, and not many that also display the Texas Republic. Unfortunately, the poorly executed revision is a serious mark against its value, particularly because it ignored the Texas boundary altogether. If the ceiling for a Levasseur is $400, this map is worth probably about $100 less. That makes it a bargain for a map with this much eye appeal, and a map that has two rare and popular features depicted. I have never associated France with bargains, so I suppose that is one way in which this is not very French at all. Remember to like and subscribe, and let me know your impressions of French culture in the comments.